What's next for the Gulf states after the Iran war and the regional scramble to find alternative security structures and security alliances? I'm Borzu Dergahi. I'm the founder of the newsletter Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. That's Borzou. Tonight on France 24, I spoke with a panel of really distinguished experts about the Gulf states, about the war with Iran and how it impacted those Gulf states. Stay tuned for some really spicy questions, particularly about the United Arab Emirates and its rather what I call destructive role in the region.
Will the Gulf ever be the same? Iran proving that missiles don't need to travel thousands of kilometers. Across the Gulf is all it takes to force the world's mightiest army to the bargaining table. Pressure on the choke point for 1/5 of the planet's oil and gas, exposing the vulnerability of Arabian Peninsula monarchies. They had spent decades building reputations as reliable havens of stability, fueled by an endless supply of petrodollars. We'll track the price of crude, the latest movement of tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, prospects for talks, and how Gulf states could rethink their alliances, with Washington in particular. Investments in the past could sometimes seem like protection money to pay for the U.S. defense shield from Tehran and its proxies, like the Houthis that in the past already hit oil installations. With Russia and now China accused of actively aiding Iran target neighbors, where do those Gulf states turn for their defense? Are they all of the same mind when it comes to Iran? And more broadly, can they restore the veneer of dream destinations as displayed by social media influencers, many of whom fled when the fighting started? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the U.S., Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula. And with us from the Qatari capital, Doha, France 24 correspondent Hoda Abdel Hamid. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
From Muscat, capital of Oman, geopolitics analyst Dawood Ansari. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
From Istanbul, reporter Borzu Dergahi, whose Badlands Substack is a go-to source on the Iran war. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And France 24 international affairs editor Kedevan Gorgestani. How's your Wednesday?
Good.
All right. You can listen, that's right, listen to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, the news moves fast. It's on Pakistan, a nation that gets more than 80% of its oil from the Gulf, that the world is now counting to play the go-between. And go-between it is. Pakistan's powerful army chief, Asim Munir, landing in Tehran after talking with Donald Trump on the phone. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif embarking on a 4-day diplomatic blitz that first takes him to Saudi Arabia, then Qatar, and Turkey. Movement on the diplomatic front, Kedevan Gorgestani, and we're getting this while at the same time there's talk of a ceasefire perhaps between Israel and Lebanon. Diplomacy is, for now, getting the top of the fold on this news day.
Yes, because we're seeing signs that there might be a little bit of movement, positive movement coming from the front of those possible negotiations between the United States and Iran. We've been talking ever since the end of this first round of talks about whether or not it would happen again. Now, the fact that the Pakistanis are in Tehran indicates that they are working very hard to try to get the two sides together. You have messages both from the Iranians and the Americans to say we've been in constant communication since the first round. Everyone is putting out messages saying we are aiming towards new talks in a few days. Donald Trump even said, you are going to have to be watching out for 2 amazing days coming up. We don't know exactly what that means, but the fact that there might be negotiations also has pushed these parties to also discuss the possibility of extending the ceasefire, because obviously, even if there are good signs for these negotiations, they're not going to be able to figure out and bridge the gap between Iran and the United States in just a week, which is when the ceasefire ends. And so now you're hearing that there might be an agreement soon to extend that ceasefire, although Donald Trump said it won't be necessary to extend the ceasefire because we're going to get a deal before that. But that's still to be figured out.
All right. Hoda Abdelhamid, our correspondent in Beirut earlier, and that's a place where they manage expectations a lot. They're used to having their hopes dashed. Quite optimistic. What's the vibe where you are?
Well, I think it's a wait and see kind of vibe. Certainly, the Gulf countries, and I tell you, here in Doha, the city has changed completely since this war started. You actually, when you go out, you do feel that a lot of people have left. It seems like as if the city was on vacation. So there is that wait and see among the population, and I think there's a flurry of diplomacy behind closed doors, and not so much behind closed doors. The Gulf countries are not directly part of the negotiations, but they're certainly making their cases with both Washington and Pakistan about the future and what kind of security guarantees they want out of all of this. I think there is a bit of a preoccupation that it might be that Donald Trump wants to extract himself from this war. The wild card here, according to the Gulf countries, being Israel, whether it would accept or not any kind of agreement, should it happen. But also what happens to the Gulf countries? Will they stay in a situation where every few months there's another sort of rising of tension, and every few months there's another confrontation somehow? So they want to restore that image of the land of stability and the land of opportunity that has been really shattered in just 6 weeks.
Yeah, the question then, and I'll put it to you, Borzo Daragahi, you have, on the one hand, you just heard it from Hoda, Gulf states who would love to see the guns go silent, but also a little bit wary if the United States just packs up and leaves without notice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really important point, and it made me think when Hoda was speaking that there really is no security, that it's always perhaps been an illusion of security in this part of the world, and that illusion has now been punctured to a large extent, and there is a scramble going on to figure out what the next arrangement is going to be. I think the main problem is you have a real disconnect in these ongoing talks. You have, on the one hand, the Iranians that are serious about making some kind of deal, but perhaps the negotiating team is disconnected from the Revolutionary Guard that actually runs the country. And then you have, on the other hand, the U.S. That is not serious, that is basically run by a game show host who doesn't have the attention span, and perhaps, let's be frank, like is not in a right state of mind at all. That probably should be removed from office for obvious and completely visible mental problems at this point, and a deputy, the J.D. Vance, who's thinking basically how is he going to turn this into a way to win the elections in 2028. So they're pretty much trying to figure out a way out, but not thinking about it in terms of the security of the region. And then you have the Gulf states, Pakistan, as well as Egypt and Turkey, these powerful regional hegemons that are also serious about working something out, but don't have any kind of veto power or real authority over the actual terms of the final agreement.
Okay, so Dawood Ansari, you heard Hoda say Doha is quieter. People are away. It feels like the city's on vacation, is what she said. You heard Borzu say that perhaps the illusion of the Gulf being a safe place has been shattered. How does it feel where you're sitting in Muscat?
Well, definitely Muscat is slightly more relaxed than perhaps Doha or Kuwait or Bahrain might have been. The biggest thing that hit us in Doha was eventually a large wave of incoming refugees from Dubai trying to catch flights to Europe. But jokes aside, it is quite a perplexed situation here over the Gulf. Life is going on very as normal as it could be, while at the same time people do understand that something is different. The what is different that obviously changed from capital to one another, just as Iran's attacks on the various capitals of the GCC have also been very different. It's perhaps quite important to say that This has been quite a good test to a certain extent of GCC defense system, which have proven to be very effective. Particularly the UAE have been under heavy attack by Iran, and nonetheless, the effectual what you can see on the ground in terms of physical effects is very limited nonetheless, and that's obviously where it actually hits the GCC states really hard. The economic effect might be quite substantial. I'm personally convinced that yes, tourism is going to return, so there will be a return to normal to a large extent, and a lot of what we're seeing is probably short-term. However, some of the things, they may just not be short-term, and particularly I'm thinking of, as you already mentioned, the image of stability. So particularly the UAE has invested a lot in the issue of this is a place of perfect security, of stability, and to a certain extent it might still be. But however, when we're talking about global capital, we're talking about the idea to attract foreign direct investments for data centers, for new factories, for bringing chemical industry into those countries. And here's the question when it comes to global competition around the
because Dawood, on that point, the last time you joined us, it was the day when an Amazon data center had been targeted, and well, that really made people nervous, you were telling us.
Absolutely, it did. For the Gulf states, economic diversification is not just a buzzword, it is an integral objective for the main purpose that populations in the Gulf are growing at an insane rate. Saudi Arabia, for instance, looking at more than 100,000 university graduates every year. They need to get jobs, and they won't find these new jobs in the oil and gas sector, which is very much saturated. They will most likely find those jobs in new sectors, and AI was supposed to be one of the very, very sectors that guarantees future employment and future economy for the Gulf, and especially these sectors being hit where capital is quite volatile and can easily move somewhere else, that hits the Gulf states where it hurts.
All right, right now there's a ceasefire, but there's still a lot of fog of war. The whole world watching the price at the pump. A lot of Tuesday was spent obsessing about a ship called the Rich Starry. It was first reported that this Chinese-owned tanker flying a Malaysian flag had sailed through the Strait of Hormuz after filling up in Iran. But it turns out that it's since reversed course. So far, 8 Iran-linked tankers have been intercepted since a U.S. blockade went into effect. Ketevan Gorjestani, March has now become April, and the oil that's not getting through is also oil, by the way, that's not being put on these tankers. The whole world's going to feel the pinch, yes, in the short term, but perhaps longer than we think.
Yes, because even if you had a sort of agreement and that the Strait of Hormuz would reopen, there would be no longer a blockade, no longer an Iranian control, it would take some time to get back into the situation. But one of the reasons that we are focused on all of these tankers, and the Rich Starry was really a good example, is that everyone was focused on whether or not these tankers would be able to sail through the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans, the naval blockade is south of the strait, at the entrance of the strait in the Gulf of Oman. That's where they have stationed 12 or 15 warships to implement that blockade. And according to the latest number by Central Command, 9 tankers have tried to get out, coming from Iranian ports, going through the Strait of Hormuz, and some of them even past the Strait of Hormuz. And then the Americans talked to them, told them, you need to turn around because you can't get through, and they cooperated. That is very important. So far, at least from what we know, all of the tankers who have tried to leave, once they've encountered the American blockade, have cooperated and turned back and gone back to the Strait of Hormuz. The question is, what happens if there is a tanker that doesn't cooperate? The Americans will have to use force. They haven't had to use force so far. It has been a deterrent, this naval blockade. They haven't had to implement it really by force. The other question is that the naval blockade is meant to blockade ships in and out of Iranian ports. That is the focus. They are not there to blockade tankers that would come from, for example, Gulf states trying to get their own oil out to the rest of the world. The question there is whether or not any of those tankers have been able to move, because we don't have any information about that. And the question there is, do these tankers that are non-Iranian affiliated feel that it is safe enough to go through there despite the threat from Iran? Because the U.S. naval blockade is there to block the Iranian ships, not protect the other ships that they say can go through.
And it looks like no one's getting through right now.
And it looks like, for now at least, no one is taking the risk, at least on the side of non-Iranian affiliated tankers. No one is taking that risk for now. And that will have an impact on the price of oil. As you were saying, it's not just the Iranian oil, it's all of the region.
In Qatar, Hoda Abdelhamid, in the Emirates, are people fans of the blockade, or do they disparage the blockade?
Well, they disparage the blockade. You know, the rest of the world looks at this blockade as the export of oil and gas and fertilizers that is much needed around the world. But the Strait of Hormuz is also very important for the everyday life of the Gulf countries. You have to think about the food that's being imported through that strait. For some countries, is up to 70% of their consumption. You have to think also about all sorts of goods, from heavy machinery to all sorts of goods that are used in daily life. So that is becoming very costly, especially to import food at the moment. The only way would be through the west coast of Saudi Arabia and then by road all the way to the different countries. For example, from Qatar, it comes from Jeddah. That increases the price of food very much, and the government has been subsidizing that. For how long can it be doing that? If you speak to any business owner in this region, they're very worried about how long the Strait of Hormuz will stay closed and how long they can keep without really working at this stage. So it is not only disparaging for the government, but also for business owners and just people at large.
Borzu Dargai, if you're a betting man, do you bet that the U.S. would shoot at a Chinese or an Indian tanker that had loaded up in an Iranian port?
Look, I don't think it would get to that point. I think these ship owners and their insurers are very conservative. Just the threat is enough to deter the ships from moving in any way forward. One thing that might be kind of interesting to think about is how, it's really a time for side deals. And it looks like that is kind of happening with countries trying to make their own accommodations. It was mentioned that Saudi Arabia, which has a Red Sea coast and a significant strategic depth compared to the other smaller Gulf countries, they're going to come out winners of all of this. Obviously, their major cities aren't, completely on the Persian Gulf coast. They're going to basically, you're going to have the UAE, Qatar, maybe even Bahrain, definitely, Kuwait, perhaps, Oman, less so. They're going to be running to daddy for protection. Saudi Arabia also has that protection deal with Pakistan. And you also had a news report today from the official Emirati news agency after basically weeks of swear words and nasty comments from Emirati social media figures against Iran, that MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, actually had a phone call today with Mohammed Bakr Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament and the major power now in Tehran. So I think that people are going to be starting to figure out their own accommodations to this situation.
Very briefly on this, Hoda Abdelhamid, the Qatari foreign ministry denying claims that it paid Iran to be able to ship some of its natural gas?
It has denied that, and also we know that it tried to have a ship go through the Strait of Hormuz, but it was diverted back to Qatar. But now the Qataris have been trying for the past few weeks to say, listen, we're pulling ourselves out of all of this. We have nothing to do with this anymore. Their position being that they were kind of betrayed by Iran, since they have been trying to do that mediating role along with Oman since well before this war started. They've been talking against the war. They also somehow, even if they don't say it so frankly, are a bit also quite angry at the United States. You know, the security arrangement, having El Udeid, the biggest U.S. base in the region, on their land, then in the end, what did it bring? What protection exactly did it bring? So I think there is a lot of discussion within the Qatari government of how to go ahead now, especially if the Qataris have always said the reality is that Iran will always remain our neighbors, and that is a fact we can't change. So how do we balance now the relation between the two sides?
And Dawood Ansari, you heard Borzu say, some in the Gulf will fare better than others. It's clear that the world's second in oil gas producer, Saudi Arabia, can weather the storm better than the Emirates. They rely entirely on the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Arabia's got that big pipeline that goes to the Red Sea. In that respect, there we can look at the map showing that pipeline. Your thoughts on how the Saudis will play this going forward? Will it be just back to business as usual for them?
I mean, to a certain extent, what the current situation is mostly about for Saudi Arabia and just for everyone else is, well, essentially surviving it and making the best what you can out of this. So even for Saudi Arabia, it would not either. Saudi Arabia is in the end profiting from this crisis. However, it might be able to come out of it without significant damage. Oman is the actor that might actually profit from the crisis in the long run because of more industry that is shifted rather to the east. However, obviously, it is the rather smaller Gulf states, and particularly Bahrain, for instance, and Kuwait to some extent, that are heavily hit by this crisis. And negatively, in Bahrain, we might see some shifts rather towards the UAE. Than Saudi Arabia. For Saudi Arabia itself, what this is about, it's about the same that all Gulf states are currently thinking about, which is the question how to create a new region, how to go forward after what's happened. Because as the other colleagues have already said, Iran is in the region. There's no way to make Iran simply disappear. The question is, what do you do with what you currently have? Obviously, the East-West pipeline has now shown to be a very, very smart investment. However, it will only be able to compensate of so much what has been lost on the East Coast that is definitely substantial for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, in his first term, Donald Trump's first trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia when the Crown Prince came for a state visit last November. Some argued that Trump is closer to Riyadh than he is to Israel. Of course, we saw that it was a decision to go to war made solely with Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel, leaving Gulf states to be surprised by it. Borzu Dargai, you heard Hoda state how those Gulf states who thought they were protected by the United States now questioning what they're getting out of it. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, are they going to change their calculus?
I think that Saudi Arabia will change its calculus, and you can see already signs that it is doing so. It is, strengthening its ties with Pakistan. There's this kind of emerging partnership coming out with, like I said, Turkey and Egypt as well, these natural regional hegemons and so on. But look, I mean, for the other Gulf states, they have to be realistic. It's an exaggeration to say that the UAE turned itself into a base for the Israeli Mossad and the U.S. military, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. That you mentioned the Amazon data center. It's not the Amazon that people think about. It's not like books and toys and stuff. We're talking about Amazon Web Services. We're talking about their cloud services. These are services that are used by intelligence services. Microsoft as well has huge contracts with the U.S. military and so on, as well as with the Israeli government. You can't be Cuba in the 1960s and set up Russian nuclear weapons on the coast of America. You can't be the UAE in the 2020s and set up American and Israeli platforms in your country if you're just off the coast of Iran. It's that kind of thing. And people just have to get used to reality. exactly as the colleague from Oman was saying, Iran is there. It's going to be there. It's the kind of the China of the region. It's a bad boy. It's does its own thing, and it's big, and you have to deal with it. And it's kind of towers over the region. It does a lot of reckless things, but it is going to be there. There's also family and historic and commercial ties that you can't get rid of just like that. So they have to deal with this, brooding, angry, big relative that you can't just get out of the relationship with.
All right, who the Gulf states turn to for protection? There had been overtures made by Saudi Arabia to China, which has a military base in Djibouti. As the Financial Times, though, reports, Beijing is close to Iran. It buys a lot of Iranian oil. Under a deal, according to the FT, paid for in yuan, the Chinese put a satellite into space in June of 2024. For civilian use, says the operator, but according to leaked Iranian information, Tehran used it to spy on sensitive targets that were hit in the month of March. And there you see basically a map of the Arabian Peninsula with all the places that got hit, Kedevan, Gorgistani. So the question is, if you're Gulf states, can you turn to China and Russia, as Russia's also offered its services, if, again, they're helping Iran in this way?
Well, I think, again, it's a question of can they or do they have to? Do they have to, in a way, diversify? Clearly, they can't fully only count on the United States because there are other players, and therefore they're going to have to figure out a way of dealing with the Chinese. And the Chinese, I think, also, like the Russians, are willing to make deals. They're not beyond making deals with two rivaling countries. That's something that they can do very well and that they will likely do if financially it is interesting, if geopolitically it is interesting. And I think for the Gulf states, it's probably more China than Russia, because at this point, it's China that is economically more attractive, and they're going to have to see how that works. The only question is also how do the United States react to possible overtures by the Gulf states to the Chinese? And right now, when you look at the reaction of Donald Trump, and it was the same reaction he had with the Russians and the same reaction he's had with the Chinese when these reports came out, is to say, basically, no, they told me that they were not helping.
Let's take a listen to that. Just as Donald Trump, shrugged off the concerns about the Russians providing intelligence to Iran, he's giving Xi Jinping, the president of China, the benefit of the doubt on alleged weapons shipments.
He responded to a letter that I wrote because I had heard that China is giving weapons to you're seeing it all over the place, to Iran, that China's
Did he
giving
say
weapons.
He's giving them?
Yeah, and I wrote him a letter asking him not to do that. And he wrote me a letter saying that essentially he's not doing that.
And of course, there is that big meeting coming up in a month's time between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump posting on Truth Social that there was absolutely no problem with Xi and that he was going to get a big fat hug from Xi when he arrives in China, and that their relationship is absolutely going great.
Hoda Abdelhamid, how do you think leaders in the Gulf are going to react to that clip we just heard?
Well, it's really difficult to gauge at this point. I think the Gulf has already started diversifying before. I think relations, for example, between Saudi and China had been warming up over the past few years. In fact, it's China that brokered an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was signed in Beijing, and that led to the opening of embassies in both Riyadh and Tehran. Now, the Gulf countries are certainly thinking that they have to diversify. They cannot only rely on the U.S. as their main, or being the main person on the international stage, may I say that. They will also want to diversify when it comes to their economy, not to rely so much on their natural resources, but try to diversify, for example, when it comes to AI or tech investment. That is something they have been looking into. Will they put all their money in the US? Will you see again, President Trump or another US president coming to the region and going home with up to $3 trillion, as it's reported in business deals? I think that might change a lot in the future. And I think many in the Gulf countries would ask their government to say, why are we just relying on one person or on one country when we have the power to have good relations with other countries?
Yeah, on that point, Dawood Ansari, of course, is always Europe. We have France's Emmanuel Macron and Britain's Keir Starmer hosting us sort of a coalition of the willing on Friday, where they're going to be talking about how to police the Strait of Hormuz. But of course, only once the fighting has stopped. Starmer, who's met with British forces last week, stationed in the Gulf. He was touring there. And let me ask you, Dawood Ansari, on the point Hoda makes, which is Gulf states want to diversify. Can they turn to Europe for things like the AI race?
I mean, generally speaking, we probably need to differentiate between what Gulf states can do, should do, and will do. These tend to be three very different things. On the will front, let me start by the intense dependency of the Gulf on the US has been quite dysfunctional for a while. It's not just started with this war earlier Trump's tariff war already. Eventually jeopardized quite a lot of economic plans that were here in the Gulf. So the US-Gulf relation is against all odds and against all dysfunctionality pretty stable. However, what can and should Gulf states do? Well, when it comes to Europe particularly, over the past years, there have been extensive attempts to engage on an economic level deeper with Europe, be it for hydrogen, be it for other issues. And most of what the GCC has perceived from Europe and all these different areas is that it's become quite a complicated relationship. It's become a relationship that is about a lot of talking, but not really a lot of following through. So as to whether the Gulf states are really looking forward to expanding the role of Europe in this security backer, perhaps rather less. But as already mentioned by the other colleagues, while China and Russia are definitely in the game, and this is not new, the Gulf states have for quite some time tried to diversify security arrangements. This is far away from any point where it could make a meaningful difference.
On that score, our ears whistled slightly earlier when we heard Borzou Daragahi criticizing the United Arab Emirates. Israel's been accused of wanting to prolong the war, and so has the Emirati leader, Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, aka MBZ. Borzou, on your Substack, you point to last week's violation of the Pakistan-brokered ceasefire on the day after it went into effect, with a warplane that targeted an oil installation in southern Iran, a French-made Mirage fighter operated regionally only by the United Arab Emirates. In case you have doubts over how you feel about it, your piece was entitled, "Why the UAE Needs to be Cut Down to Size," and it argues that the Emirates are as much, if not more, of a threat to the region as Iran. Is that not a slight exaggeration?
I don't think so. Not if you look at the list of the things that the UAE has been involved with, including the genocide in Sudan, including the support they've given to genocidaire and atrocity-bearing militias in Ethiopia, its support for dictators in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, its kind of involvement in Yemen that was so extreme and so against norms that even Saudi Arabia, MBS, went against it. I think that the UAE has been extremely adventurous in terms of its foreign policy gambits. I think that other Gulf countries it's also gone up against, including Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And it's a problematic country, and it just slides under the radar because it manages to pay off the Trump administration and buy jets and other weapons from Europe, and that makes UAE a kind of good customer. But I think the UAE is problematic. I think the UAE does problematic stuff all over the region, North Africa and the Middle East.
And do you think that after this war is over, that perception will become more common?
I mean, I don't want to get into this right now, but, if you talk to other people in the Arab world, I mean, they have a view of the Emiratis that is even more kind of troublesome than mine. And, the Emiratis and the Emirati chauvinism throughout the Arab world is well known. I hope that there is a sort of reckoning for the Emirates. And I don't mean all of I should say, I think that, the Emirates is diverse as well. And a lot of there's 7 Emirates in the UAE. And, maybe 1 or 2 of them are actually the ones that are pushing this very adventurous, very high risk foreign policy that is very damaging to the region.
Hod Abdelhamid, a few years back, the outlier was Qatar, at odds with Saudi Arabia. Now, since February the 28th, is the UAE the outlier, or did that start long before?
I think it started before that because, as Borzu just said, of the UAE and Saudi Arabia being at odds in many places like Yemen, like Sudan and others. So that had started a while ago. And there was a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia between Doha and Riyadh. Now, what happens in the future is quite difficult for me to predict, in the sense that now it seems that all of the GCC countries are on the same side and all agree with each other. But that will be cracking at the seams as soon as this war was over. I think they all agree with the fact that they don't want a destabilized Iran or a failed state in Iran. That will be the last thing they want coming out of Iran. But what Saudi Arabia would like is certainly to have a weakened government in Iran, on which Saudi Arabia or maybe the United States could have some sort of influence that would increase the clout of Saudi Arabia in the region. Now, the wild card comes in. How would the UAE react to that? Because, as Borzu said, the UAE also has very much ambition of being the GCC country, the troublemaker, the wild boy of this region.
Dawood Ansari, which way will it go?
Oh, well, that's pretty hard to say. I mean, I would say between GCC states and B within GCC states, there's quite a lot of disagreement about where should the future go and what do you want. As Huda has already said, the only thing that's clear to everyone is GCC states want an Iran that is stable and that is making less trouble. How to achieve that? That is eventually the big question that all GCC states have. Whether there's going to be more or less US involvement, more or less Pakistan involvement. This is something where there's also quite distance, even within the UAE that we already talked about. So we had obviously that famous tweet of Anwar Gargash who said that probably the UAE is going to get even closer to the US than we've seen quite another signals from other parts of the government. So what we're seeing is actually here, we're seeing multiple front lines being open all at once. So obviously the alliance between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that is still very much an open conflict about regional hegemony. What all those deals with Iran over the past 10 years have been about is about geo-economizing the region and about to bringing Iran to a point where Iran can be submerged into an economically stable region. As we've seen now, that definitely hasn't helped, that hasn't worked, and Iran wants its seat at the table back.
Iran, which, as our panelists have been saying, is not going away. We began this hour talking about the vibe, how it's changed since February the 28th. We remember at the outset those influencers in the week the war began, the ones stuck in the Gulf who had long bashed their native lands. Back in December, a French reality TV star said on television here, "For nothing in the world would I return to France. Here in Dubai, I sleep with the doors unlocked and the windows open." Her name was Maïva Guélan. This was what she had to say on the day the war started.
On a tous nos passeports ici dans nos TT. Non mais on sait jamais. Et parce que il faut être, je sais pas moi, il faut. Si jamais pas de châle, il y a une grande guerre, il faut partir. On est des Français, hein. La France, protégez-nous, hein.
France, protect us. Ketevan Gorjestani, much was made of that.
Much was made of that, and there was a lot of, now you need France, and now you're turning back to your country, even though you haven't been paying taxes, because that was sort of the messaging there. What was very interesting was that she was absolutely not the only one who did this, but all of a sudden, you saw all of those influencers who were posting about, the missiles coming in and the explosions and things like that, and all of a sudden, there was a crackdown, and there was a change in rhetoric, and these same influencers returned to saying, no, we're fine, everything is going well, probably under pressure from local authorities in a way to say, stop talking about the bad parts of what is happening right now. But I think besides the sort of fun blaming game of influencers, it does show something, which is that we're talking about diversifying the economy. And there's this idea that a lot of these Gulf states have diversified and have become a sort of haven for luxury, for fun, for stability. And influencers are not the only one. Sports, all of those events that were brought to the Gulf, the Grand Prix for Formula One, MotoGP, the Finalissima between Spain and Argentina. All of those events were canceled because of what is going on right now. So what this does is sort of chip away at this idea that this is a place that has money, has fun, has modernity, but has also safety and security. And that part, the safety and security, is being chipped away. It could come back, obviously, if this war ends, but it might not come back exactly the way it was before.
Borzo Dargahi, with those influencers falling in line, be it with carrot or sticks, will people then have a short memory? And is it a parable for the money from the Gulf that goes into things like the tech sector in Europe and the United States?
I mean, the parable is that I think these places are just not that great of places, personally, and I think that they're kind of really fake. And we can contrast them to Oman, for example, which is a really real place with real people, and they don't pay influencers to lie about how wonderful it is to live there, because actually a country like Oman is actually wonderful. And it's got real beauty and real culture. So I would think that that's the main problem. The UAE, Dubai, for example, used to have really cool parts of the city, and they destroyed them and turned them into shopping malls and highways. And then they hire people to pump this lifestyle up. I think that's a shame. And I think that these places are so built on speculative hype and speculative capital that they're bound to at some point come falling down.
All right, we'll have to unfortunately leave it there. Borzo Dargahi, who's not a fan of skyscrapers and going to the mall by the sound of it. Thank you for being with us from Istanbul. I want to thank Hoda Abdelhamid in Doha, Dawood Ansari in Muscat, Ketevan Gorjestani. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24.
And thanks for watching and listening. This is Borzo Dargahi of the Badlands podcast. Thank you so much.